It's great to be here with you all today, and I'm absolutely thrilled to be part of Sailpoint's Back to the Future event. In this digital age that we're living in, we are so dependent on all of our devices, and the cyber threats just keep growing and growing and growing, and there's no stop to it. But right at the center of it is our identity. And that impacts us as individuals as well as employees for companies or even as clients or customers of other companies. So today, I'd like to take you through a bit of a whirlwind of futuristic technologies and cyber threats and where things are going to go into the future. But from my viewpoint, identity is really smack right in the middle of everything that we say and do in this new world that we're moving into. And like Sailpoint, I adopt a zero trust model. So from the perspective of cybersecurity, one of the biggest concerns that I have is identity theft, because it impacts people on both an individual level, but it also impacts everybody that is also an employee of a company, because if their identity is compromised, that could compromise a lot of different things within an organization. And frankly, even if you're an organization and you have something like a data breach or a hack, and you've accidentally disclosed sensitive information that compromise people's identity, then there are ramifications for you from a privacy and a legal perspective as well. So the implications of identity theft are actually huge, and they're getting bigger and bigger and bigger all the time. So in the last couple of years, we have changed as a society more than anyone could have predicted back in December of 2019. In 2019, if I had said that the norm would be working from home and perhaps at some stage a few years later getting back into hybrid working, going in and out of lockdowns, and basically taking people out of their secure work environment and having them perhaps initially using personal devices and later moving to company devices, but having the security perimeter completely changed to one that now has to encompass home devices. You would have thought, no way, that's not going to happen. But in 5 months of the pandemic, in the first 5 months, we saw 5 years of technology adoption happen. And in the 2 years that have transpired, we've seen about 10 years of technology adoption. And it's continuing. So when you think about work from home, you probably are thinking about knowledge workers and computers, but it's going to continue to expand with things like virtual reality and augmented reality and robots that can be controlled remotely and scientific instruments that can be controlled remotely. All of these things are actually possible to do now and have been possible to do for quite a number of years. But because of this situation that we now find ourselves in, they're happening in the here and now. So from a cybersecurity perspective, that means our perimeter is expanding and expanding and expanding. And from the perspective of what can be attacked and what can be hacked, that vector is also expanding more and more. We also have some new technologies, or newish, I would say, that are starting to become mainstream. And here I'm talking about the metaverse. And, in the chat, put your thoughts about the metaverse. Have you used it? Do you like it? To give you an example, let me just define what the metaverse is. We're talking about a digital world where you're completely immersed in what may be a twin of the real world, but may be something completely fantastical. You probably will be wearing virtual reality headsets, which, by the way, can get really uncomfortable after a while. But in the metaverse, you're using cryptocurrencies like Bitcoin and others to buy these digital assets. Things like property. I mean, who would have thought that you might spend $1 million on a house that actually doesn't exist other than in the metaverse? But in the meantime, there are other things that we'll be doing in the metaverse. Things, for instance, like holding meetings in the metaverse, or maybe doing product trials or focus groups. I think that one of the real values that we'll see out of the metaverse is prototyping and getting fast feedback on products and services that we may have. But right now, it's quite unregulated and it's the wild, wild west. And by the way, there's not just one metaverse, there are lots of different metaverses. And while this might seem like a brand new concept, very early instantiations of this were with something called Second Life that happened years and years and years ago. So much to say on the metaverse, but let me just continue on. We have, in the last number of years, seen super hacks on the rise. I could spend my entire presentation talking about super hacks, but let me talk to you for a moment about some that really have me worried, because they are what I would call supply chain vector attacks. So when I talk about that, I'm talking about hacks that are aimed at software or hardware that gets implemented by a lot of other companies. So the target isn't necessarily the company that's hacked. The target is the company's clients. So one of the first that happened that was very worrisome was all the way back in 2015, when Juniper had its source code somehow hacked into. And I think it must have been an insider job, because they literally put in an administrative backdoor that allowed people to log into the secure VPNs that were used all over the world by governments and corporations for security purposes. And this hack or insider job was so well done that even with very stringent code reviews, it wasn't picked up for quite a while. In 2021, we saw a similar attack from a company on a company called SolarWinds. So SolarWinds is a company that has software called Orion that is used by about 30,000 corporations around the world to control their IT management. And again, this was probably a very well-funded state actor that managed to do this hack and gain control over all kinds of sensitive information and systems and gather up all kinds of intelligence. Again, there are so many hacks that there just isn't time to go through all of them, but beware, they're on the rise and we need to be diligent. One of the vectors that is absolutely going through the roof are ransomware attacks. And one of the big ones in the last year was on the Colonial Pipeline in the United States. And that ended up disrupting the flow of petrol or gasoline, depending on which part of the world you're in, from the southern part of the US all the way up along the eastern seaboard. And what's interesting about this hack is that they actually targeted the billing system, but the company decided that they were going to shut down the pipeline because they couldn't charge for the petrol that was being put out. Another one that was very worrying were two hacks that happened against Toll, which is a logistics and shipping company, and it impacted us really badly here in Australia. And these were two separate ransomware attacks, and it basically brought a lot of shipping to a standstill, and Toll was forced to shut down its servers and have its staff use their personal computers to keep things going. But of course, they're in the middle of this major crisis, but by introducing personal devices, who knows what kind of other things may inadvertently get introduced when one is in that kind of situation. So here we are in the COVID world, and for many of us, we still have to use these check-in apps. I'm based in Queensland, so I decided to use a picture of the Queensland check-in app that I'd been using for the last, long time, including going to the airport on Friday. And every single one of states and territories in Australia has a different check-in app. Every country, or within each country, different states and territories has different check-in apps. Queensland, to their credit, actually has a really good privacy disclosure statement that tells you how data is encrypted and where it's going and so on. But in India, back in 2020, back in the beginning days of COVID, they were using GPS with their local equivalent of that app. And unfortunately, hackers were able to use these GPS signals to triangulate where people who might have COVID were, because they built in this feature into the app to let people know if they might be near somebody who had reported having some sort of symptoms. And the security community said, look, you shouldn't be using GPS, you should be using Bluetooth. Last night, I was actually looking at the Apple Store at the Indian app, and it looked like it had a number of updates in 2020, and then the last update was in January of this year. But interestingly, on the Apple page that lets you download the app, it said, oh, and by the way, your location may be tracked even if the app isn't in use. And I get really concerned about apps that track location and may be tied to vaccine certificates, which have your identity in them, and how secure this information is with so many different apps out there, and increasingly requirements to download an app for wherever you happen to travel. And you just don't know all the ins and outs of that app. So another area that is of major concern to me that a lot of companies don't pay attention to is the security of email. For some reason, people seem to have it in their heads that email is secure. Well, unless it's encrypted, I'm sorry, it's not. It's open text. And even if you are smart enough to be using SSL or other security technologies, when you configure your email, it's only secure in transit. It's not secure at rest. And there are all kinds of companies that send really sensitive information by email. And I've seen it personally. If you have any kind of medical referral, chances are it's sent by email. If you have a prescription that's sent from your doctor to your pharmacy, it's probably sent by email, along with information here in Australia, like your Medicare number and your date of birth and all sorts of other really sensitive information. I've seen a lot of financial companies send either plain text email or unsecured PDFs with sensitive data, including birth dates, by email. I've even seen security companies do it, of all things. People need to understand that we should be using secure portals for this, and it's especially companies that need to take the lead on this. So what kind of technologies are we going to have in the future, and where is all this going to be leading us? Well, one of the technologies that is actually a big umbrella term for a lot of different technologies is artificial intelligence. And AI uses techniques like machine learning and deep learning, which analyze massive data sets, but it encompasses a lot of different technologies. So I'm talking about things like natural language processing, which include voice and text. So we're talking about things like chatbots and digital assistants and speech translation. We're talking about biometrics, facial recognition, fingerprint recognition, even emotion detection. We're talking about pattern recognition, which is super important in the cybersecurity world, big data analytics. We're talking about robots, which are the physical instantiation of AI. All of this comes under this big AI umbrella, but AI is still a relatively new technology. And the bigger the AI network gets, the bigger the neural network is, the more obtuse it is in terms of how it's making its decisions. So unless you have hooks in there, which I'll talk about in a moment, for human reinforcement, not even the AI researchers know exactly how an AI is making its decision. And it's going to get even crazier as we move into the future, because quantum computing is coming online really fast. So without going into quantum physics, a really simple definition of quantum computing is super powerful computers. And in fact, late last year, Harvard invented a quantum computer that was capable of 256 qubits. The number of simulations that you can do with 256 qubits is more than the number of atoms in our solar system. That is huge. Combine that with AI, and you can just see that the power of AI is going to grow exponentially once it's on a quantum computing platform. So one of the new jobs of the future that I think we're going to see are AI trainers that actually act as the guardians or gatekeepers of the kinds of decisions that AI makes. Because remember, your reputation from a company perspective is going to be based on the things that come out of your company. And if an AI is making that decision for you, then that impacts your company's reputation. And ethics is a really big part of it. So if you've got this really big database and it has information in there that is biased, and your company makes decisions based on biased information, then that reflects poorly on your company. So this is going to be a big new job of the future. Another way that AI is going to be used in the here and now, and even more so in the future, is inside of robots. And one of the really neat things that's happening with robots is that instead of programming them, you're actually able to train them with imitation learning. So if you can imagine, you've got a human using virtual reality with gesture control that is able to teach a robot how to do different things, like pick up a piece of cloth versus picking up a delicate glass vase. And that is, in some AI researchers' opinions, the way that AI is really going to learn. So let's shift a little bit in our topics to smart cities, which is another area that is becoming really big. As of right now, there are over 12 billion sensors that have been deployed for the Internet of Things globally around the world. Not all of them are used for smart cities. They're used in all kinds of applications. But what this means is that the perimeter of things that could potentially be hacked and attacked has suddenly expanded beyond just computers and devices and robots to all of these different sensors. And in fact, in some of the scenarios that are really dark cyber scenarios, you see these smart city attacks where hackers or state actors literally use all of these devices to bring a city down to its knees. And in fact, we may be witnessing some of that right now with the war that's happening in Ukraine. This is an ongoing threat. So when I talk about the Internet of Things, it's also really important to understand how that fits with cybersecurity. Is there any security on a thing like a fridge that you buy that has an IoT sensor. Is it done with firmware? Can it be updated? Is it done with open source software? And if so, when does that software get updated and has a patch been applied? All of these things that we're putting into our homes and our offices, whether they be fridges, whether they be hearing aids, cute little robots, smart cities, all of these are presenting brand new attack vectors and need to be secured. So I spoke a little bit earlier about privacy, and this is absolutely fundamental to identity, because once your privacy is breached, your identity is breached too. And if that happens, then one can gain control over pretending to be you, but in a company or corporate context, as well as an individual context. So I think one of the new jobs that we will see is a privacy guardian, and it's going to center around protecting your identity and helping you recover from identity theft. Unfortunately, if somebody's got your date of birth, and that's one of the key vectors we use to enable somebody's identity, then how are you ever going to get that back? You basically would have to die to get a new date of birth, and that's not going to happen and have you continue on. So it is quite serious, and I do believe that we will see a new job of the future centered around being privacy guardians. So I spoke a bit earlier about ethics, and this is just so important, especially in this age of AI, where decisions are made faster than a human can keep track of. Because what we need to remember is that regulations and the law today are based around humans making decisions, but we're in this world already now where AI is starting to make decisions for us, and things can go horribly wrong. There was a game called Coast Runner that was part of an AI experimental lab, and the idea was to cross the finish line with as many points as possible. And the AI decided that instead of crossing the finish line, it was going to get ultra competitive, crash into other boats, and do all sorts of other things. It just went completely rogue. Now, that's a funny example, but what if that was something that was happening within your company? And, what are the ethics of AI? How do you make decisions on things like driverless cars? Who gets hurt in an accident? Who doesn't? I think another new job of the future is going to be a chief ethics officer, and that's going to tie very much into this whole world of AI. So as we go into the future, are we going to take technology into our bodies? Will we become part cyborgs? Well, the answer is probably. And it probably will start with smart contacts. And I'll talk about that a bit later. But first, I'd like to sort of jump ahead into the future into brain implants. So imagine putting either a chip or a nanobot into your brain. And research, by the way, has been going on in this area for more than 10 years. It was initially aimed at helping people with diseases like Alzheimer's and dementia be able to regain their memories, which is, something that I'm sure we'd all like to see. Newer research is aimed at helping people with spinal cord injuries be able to walk again. But there's also been research that's been going on for a number of years by organizations like DARPA, where you have the ability to have some sort of chip, let's say in a soldier's brain, that is able to control pain if they're injured, but also control emotions for things like post-traumatic stress. So imagine you've got a chip in your brain and it's controlled by your employer. Who owns that chip and what happens when you cease working for them? But the idea that's being promulgated for brain implants has to do very much with being able to connect your brain to the internet. So how cool would it be to have a question and be able to download the answer or download a new skill? But oh my God, what happens if your brain gets hacked? What are you going to do? Well, you're not going to just reboot and refresh. So let's go to smart contacts for a moment. Smart contacts have been in the works for at least 10 years that I've been tracking. And if you can think of everything that you have on a smartphone, plus augmented reality and probably virtual reality and biotech, these three things are separately being worked on now. And there are already companies that are starting to come out with smart contacts that do all of these individual things. So there are pharma companies that have designed smart contacts that are able to detect your intraocular pressure, to detect pre-glaucoma, or to do drug delivery. There are companies that are designing smart contacts that will allow you to have a view that gives you augmented reality type glasses, but from a contact lens, and a whole lot more. What happens when they all converge? And there are also sensors that are being designed that can either be part of the smart contact and test chemicals from your tear ducts, or maybe even implanted into your teeth to test your biofluids from inside your bodies. So we're getting to an age now where technology is starting to merge with biology. So what's going to happen as we go into the future? Well, I think we're going to see a lot more of this. We're also going to see a lot more with stem cells. Already, researchers are using techniques like bioprinting, which is 3D printing with bioinks, to be able to do replacement skin and cartilage and veins, and experiments already to do replacements of whole organs like your liver or your heart. That's probably 10 years off. But then there are also things like genetic engineering, where researchers believe that they will find the gene that is able to control aging and stop aging, and eventually be able to go backwards in time. Imagine if you could live to 400 or 800 years old. Oh my gosh, what in the world is that going to do? So with only a couple of minutes left, I'd like to change course once again to what I see as a future threat vector. Many of you would have heard of deep fakes. So deep fakes are videos that look like you, they sound like you, but they're not you. So if you can imagine that you've done a number of speeches in the public, maybe you're a company CEO, and there's a lot of your information that's in the public domain, and somebody has hacked that. They've used AI algorithms to design what looks and sounds like you, but isn't you. And suddenly you're saying things that you haven't actually really said, like telling your chief financial officer to release $1 million payment to somebody that's not you. One of the things that I think might happen in the future is that real-time video feeds, perhaps something like we're doing today, could be hacked with a deep fake. So what if we were doing an internal video conference and we're talking about a sensitive merger or acquisition, and you think you're talking to your teammates, but you're not. You're actually talking to a hacker, and you're disclosing information that needs to be disclosed to the stock market before it goes public. Wow, that's a new cybersecurity threat that is going to just blow away everything that we've seen so far. So if you can imagine, in a scenario like that, who would actually be responsible? Would it be the person who's been tricked into leaking information? Would it be the vendor of the video system or the software? Would it be the hacker, or would it be somewhere else? I'd love to hear your thoughts on who might actually be responsible. And remember, we're getting into this age of super fast AI that's powered by quantum computers. So as we go into the future, I see that AI is going to be an essential, absolutely essential tool for cybersecurity firms. And if they're not using AI already, I'd be shocked. But wars of the future, I think, will be fought completely on an AI platform. And AI and cybersecurity and cyber threats are going to mesh like this. So I'd like to thank you very much for joining me this morning. And I'd be very happy to answer any questions in the Q&A. And please connect to me on LinkedIn. I look forward to speaking with you soon. Thank you very much.
Thank you, Shara. So the first question is a two-part question. So with the rise of deep fakes, how can identity be protected in a VR meeting, Shara?
Oh, look, this is going to be one of the questions that is fantastically challenging. And I think that the way we're going to do it is using artificial intelligence and pattern recognition and biometrics. So if I think about deep fakes, what you're doing is you're actually, if you like, skinning a video of someone and putting it onto an actor. But no matter how good the actor is, even if they're somebody like Alec Baldwin, who's pretending to be Donald Trump, his mannerisms are going to be slightly different than the real Donald Trump. And this is with a trained actor. With most deep fake videos, they're not trained actors who are doing this. They're other people. So if you've got pattern recognition and you've got really good biometrics that actually understand how people gesture and how they move their face and their hands and posture and all these other different biometric, unique individual markers, and AI is analyzing it in real time, then you start to get a way that you can detect in real time whether it's the person you think you're talking to, whether it's a deep fake, or even in the metaverse, because that's, I think, a question that other people have asked as well. So I think that's going to be a big part of the solution. And as we get into this world of quantum computing, remember that our computers are going to be really, really powerful, and that's going to allow us to do this in real time.
Wow, so I think you've answered the second part of this question slightly, but I'll ask it anyway. So perhaps with this then, how can you trust the voice of the Metaverse avatar you're speaking to, especially if they're your co-worker or client, and ensuring that they're not a malicious actor?
Well, that's actually a little bit different, because if you're talking about a Metaverse avatar, I could look like I'm a cat, or I could look like I'm a cartoon character. And that's a lot harder because you can't use AI to pick up, let's say, the gestures of a person, or the unique things that a person would do, because there's nothing for them to really compare it against. Where you would be using AR to check the avatar would be more in terms of looking at the words used, like the specific words. Is it the language and the cadence of one's voice and the tone of one's voice that the real person would be using? Does that match the avatar? Then you can start to do, again, this biometric pattern recognition in real time, but it's a different aspect of that pattern recognition.
Thanks, Shara. I stand corrected with that second part of the question.
That's okay.
Thank you. Moving on to the next one. How do you see encryption and authentication working in the future once quantum computing becomes more mainstream?
Well, number one, once quantum computing becomes mainstream, today's encryption is going to be broken in no time flat. That's the bad news. The good news is that cybersecurity researchers all around the world in lots of different companies and in research labs are working on quantum-based encryption. And I've actually talked to quantum physicists about some of the really weird and wonderful and wacky ways of using encryption, including micro wormholes, putting encrypted stuff down micro wormholes to be able to protect the sovereignty of information. Like, that's how weird and wacky it might get into the future. So even though we might destroy today's encryption, I think coincident with that, we're going to have other new ways of encrypting.
Well, so insightful. Shara, I've got the next one here for you. Do you have a view on when we might reach a level of general AI as opposed to today's level of narrow AI?
That's such a great question. And even AI researchers are really divided on that answer. Today's AI solutions that you would buy commercially are very much narrow AI focused on doing specific things. Although there are researchers that are looking very heavily at how do you start to train AI to multitask like us humans do. And the key here, I think, is when quantum computing starts to become mainstream, then AI is going to have enough computing juice to be able to start doing that. Now, researchers a few years ago, before some of the latest quantum advances, were figuring 2050 to 2075, depending on how fast or how slow quantum computing becomes a reality. I think that's going to dovetail very closely into when AI is able to multitask. Now, multitasking is not the same as general AI being able to do everything that a human does. So it's going to start with being able to do multiple things and then start to branch out. But I think that for the foreseeable future, and I'm talking decades, we're going to need humans in the loop because AI, the bigger that neural network gets, the more obtuse it is to researchers and the more chance there is for something to go really, really, really wrong.
And I definitely like that picture with humans still in it, Shara. Absolutely. Using your example of the chip in a soldier's head and noting that cyber vulnerabilities are always found and exploited, how can we ensure that chips aren't exploited by the enemy or by enemy soldiers to cripple their force?
Well, that's such a good question. So let me go back to medical devices in general, because that's where, we would probably start using chips. Today with medical devices, just about every implantable device has some sort of wireless access, but it's actually near-term wireless access. So if we had chips that presumably would want wireless access because you don't want to have to do major surgery on your brain every time you do a software update, that would be kind of ridiculous. But if you keep it to something that's in close proximity, there's less likelihood that it can be hacked. However, if we get to the stage where we start connecting our brains to the wider internet, then all bets are off. How in the world are you going to protect any endpoint that's connected to the wider internet from potentially bad software updates or hacking or, any of the other things that happen in the cyber world today, but that chip just happens to be in somebody's brain as opposed to in a computer or in an IoT device?
God, thanks, Shara. This one's a bit of a mouthful, so just bear with me. So much of the attraction of the metaverse is an alternate reality. How will one manage identities and privacy when a core feature of the metaverse may take an alternative identity and potentially participate in activities that one may not consider in the real world?
Again, that's an area of the wild, wild west. Right now, the metaverse is so new, and it's not just one metaverse. There's, Facebook's version of the metaverse. There's somebody else's version of the metaverse. And the answer is going to be different in every one of these different digital realities. But the bottom line is that if you're creating a fake persona that acts in ways that you or I don't act in the real world with our real persona, how can you protect that? The answer is maybe you can't, but then maybe you can use some of the AI tools that I described earlier. But more importantly is if you've created a fake persona to play around in the metaverse and that fake persona gets compromised, what are the real world implications? Well, maybe your gaming experience isn't as much fun, but actually, so you're disappointed, but who cares? That's not actually catastrophic. I'm much more concerned about our real world persona being compromised by something that we may do in the metaverse than I am about a fake persona that we might have.
Indeed. And we've got time for one more, Shara.
Sure, go for it.
The last one is, what software or options are out there to help detect a deep fake?
Well, I've mentioned a lot of techniques already that can be used theoretically to detect deepfakes. And I know for sure that there are a lot of AI researchers that are taking these and similar concepts and playing around with them in research labs. But I'm not familiar with any particular solution that's an off the shelf solution that you can buy today.
Indeed. Well, thanks for answering that one. I know it's a bit of a cheeky question,
Yeah,
but
but
with
it's a
that,
good one.
it's a good one. Oh, absolutely, I would have tried that one. So, Shara, that's all we had time for today. Again, thank you for joining the Back to the Future show, and hopefully we can have you back on once again in the future.
I would love to do that. And thanks, everyone, for asking such great questions. I really enjoyed this.
Indeed. Thanks, Shara. Take care.